Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us here on New Jersey Revolution Radio. I do know that we're used to seeing Diane Moxley here on Wednesday nights, but tonight I'm filling in. Diane's taking a week off, and she's been working real hard. And she earned it. As many of you know, we don't make any money here at New Jersey Revolution Radio. Our talent and our organization is run on a little bit of grassroots donations and people power. And we're doing pretty well, but we could always use your help. We could always use it to chip in. Tonight we have a great guest on. I saw some bands, and it's a musical guest. And those of you out on the live stream right now, I encourage you to listen to the podcast after this when we put it all together, because we're going to cut in the music then. But hopefully, if we keep growing and we keep sustaining these donation levels, I think eventually we're going to get that technology. But that's what we are right now, and we understand that. We're grassroots. We don't have all the fancy bells and whistles you see on bigger media companies, but that's the way we want it to be. And your contributions, it really means a lot to us, because it keeps us out of that corporate mess. The more I can rely on you as a grassroots donor, the less I have to rely on donations or organizations which might pull us off an anti-capitalist path. That's the path we want to take here at New Jersey Revolution Radio. I had the opportunity to go to a show in Brooklyn last week, as I was saying during the intro, for this Black Flags Over Brooklyn event. I didn't know what to expect, I'll be honest with you. I'm an old metalhead going way back, and I grew up on Slayer and Megadeth. And as I've come to learn left politics and understand the detrimental effects of racism and capitalism on people, it's been hard for me to reconcile the fact that I listen to bands which use racist imagery or have said racist things in the media or covered racist music. And it's part of my personal journey to deal with white privilege and all that. But I'm talking tonight to a guy who's really come pretty far in that journey. And I appreciate what you do, and you've been doing it for a long time. Money from the band Racetraitor. How are you tonight, man? Thanks for joining me.
Hey, man, it's so great to be here.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit just about your personal journey. How did you come to be in an anti-racist metal band?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I kind of got into music. I got into music as a really young age. I was sort of, I guess, a little bit of a social outcast. So I was listening to music that I thought was for social outcasts. So I was listening kind of a lot of like the post-punk stuff, like The Cure, The Smiths, and that kind of got me into my sort of foyer into heavier music was actually through industrial. So really bands like Ministry, Tereb, those bands kind of like started me getting into stuff that was heavier. And I grew up with these kids that were always kind of in the same class as me, in junior high and high school. One kid's name was Dan, and one kid's name was Brent, and they were always like the metalheads in the classes. They always had the Slayer shirts. It kind of freaked me out. Metallica, because I was more into like Black Eyeliner pop and stuff like that. So we around like late in high school, we all sort of became friends, and mostly going to like underground hardcore shows, like basement shows. And so they were all ex-metalheads. I was kind of, the closest I got to metal was maybe Ministry at that point. And then we all became friends, started going to these punk and hardcore shows. And that's how we got like really heavily involved in music. And those guys were playing instruments. So they were playing guitar and bass. And,
right.
Within a few years, we started doing this band. And everybody was just like, we want to bring more and more metal influence. That's our roots. That's what we listened to as kids. We listened to Slayer and Metallica. And this was in the 90s, mid-90s. And so the band kind of started out as a power violence and grind band, which is like for, those in your audience who aren't necessarily familiar, those are really, really fast versions of punk and metal. So grind is kind of the more metal tip and power violence is the more punk tip. And we were something in between. Then we got this drummer who we referred to as the death metal drummer. He was 16 years old. His name's Andy. And he just could do double bass like nobody we'd ever met before.
Right.
So we're just like, okay, we're just now in the position to just be a metal band sonically. So we were playing metal shows, but we were also playing, and we're probably more closely identified with the hardcore scene. But if anybody knows anything about the hardcore scene in the 90s, it started getting really metal. And we were sort of one of the first bands, I think, in that scene that just full on embraced what is now called extreme metal. There wasn't really that umbrella term wasn't there yet. You know, you had thrash metal, and you had speed metal, and you had death metal, and you started having some other genres at that time.
Let me ask you, because now this is how out of it, man. I used to know this stuff, but I've always considered myself a death metal fan. Grindcore, I like grindcore a lot. I like that and how does extreme metal differ from that kind of version of metal?
So extreme metal is the umbrella. It's like an umbrella term.
Yeah.
So grindcore, black metal, death metal, tech metal, all of that stuff fits under it. So if it has a lot of blast beats, has a lot of, you know, screaming vocals as opposed to kind of like, you know, stung stuff. Even to some extent, thrash metal now, like even like classic stuff like Slayer might be considered extreme metal. It's sort of on the edge of it.
Sure.
But extreme metal is like a catch-all term.
Okay.
So if you're just a type of metal that's like, I guess, more vicious than Metallica and Megadeth, then you probably fall into extreme metal, which is most of what metal is today. So even things like doom metal, which is just like really slow and heavy.
Behemoth kind of stuff.
Yeah, Behemoth is a good example. That type of stuff would even be considered is considered extreme.
Wow.
So it's a broad. It's not really a genre. It's more of like a catch-all.
You tour. You do quite a good number of shows. I see you've got some upcoming. How is this a full-time gig for you, man? I mean, how do you make your way? Is this
not at all? It's so everybody in the band's got some sort of full-time job.
Right.
Our drummer's a full-time musician. He plays in like 6 or 7 bands. We're actually the smallest band he's in. So he's got bands that do like year-long tours all over the world and stuff. And we're just we're his like most punk project. Though he's got some other underground bands he's in too. He's in a band called Sect, which is a very similar sort of band.
You've actually had some members of your band come out and be in some pretty big, more mainstream bands.
Yeah. So our drummer is in that mainstream band.
Oh, we don't want to. Are we going to not name the band?
We can name them.
Plug them, man. Plug away. Give the brother a plug.
Okay, so our drummer is in the band called Fall Out Boy, which is anything but extreme metal.
Right.
But they are, you know, a sort of pop punk band.
Sure.
A lot of kids came up on it. It was kind of, and it's interesting because we get people at our shows that got into extreme music through being 13 years old and listening to Fall Out Boy, reading in some interview somewhere that the guys from Fall Out Boy have roots in, you know, bands like Racetraitor. And, you know, we've been, you know, we were mentioned in Rolling Stone, you know, these guys from Fall Out Boy used to be in this band called Racetraitor. And that was like, whoa, we're mentioned in Rolling Stone. And
so we've all heard Fall Out Boy. Now I wanted to play some music, as I was saying.
Yeah.
And I believe I was listening to you on my Alexa through Spotify. I'm sorry, you know, that I do cooperate with Jeff Bezos, but she seems to have forgotten who Racetraitor is. I want to see if maybe it'll work before we move on to play a little bit for our live stream audience, if we can get it to work. Alexa, play Racetraitor on Spotify.
I can't find songs by Racetraitor on Spotify.
So maybe Alexa's censoring us because we get every once in a while Facebook will block something because Racetraitor, because they think it's like, I mean,
right.
it is a term used by white nationalists.
Right.
So we're reappropriating it. And so maybe that's what's going on. I don't know.
I'm telling you, about 20 minutes before the show, I was listening. I've been listening to you all day, and I was all geeked up to play it. But you know what? That's the best we could do. So we'll try again. We will edit some in, and for my recorded version to save me some editing time, I'll say, here's some music by Racetraitor.
I think
we're a band called Racetraitor. And we took that name Racetraitor from the Nazis, and we took it back. And we said there's no better thing to be. And we're gonna take their riffs, and we're gonna take their music, and we're gonna take their double bass. Because joy is ours, and violence and despair is theirs.
So you talked a little bit about the appropriation of the name Race Traitor. When did that happen in the band's history? You have this, you grew up together basically, right? And then you decided to become Race Traitor at what point and start this journey?
So some of the guys in the band were in this band called Hinckley. You don't know who Hinckley is. He's the guy who tried to assassinate Reagan. So
right. Yes.
They were in this band called Hinckley before, and Hinckley broke up because of like personal disputes between the members. And I had put out the Hinckley 7-inch, right? So they put out a 7-inch EP, and I did it. On a DIY label that I started. It was our first and last record on that label. And so they basically asked me to be in the follow-up version of the band. And they basically came to me with the name. So they're like, hey guy, do you want to be this? We want to do this band. We want to call it Race Traitor. The reason, I think there's a lot of lore within the band about where the name came from, but the most settled upon one is that our guitar player, Dan, his half of his family's from Kentucky. And, and not even like Louisville, like, a place you've never heard of in Kentucky. Mm-hmm. And he was watching some episode of Donahue or something where some, Nazi or skinhead was on there and was calling all these other people in the audience, white people, race traitors, because they were, not Nazis essentially.
I remember those shows.
And he said, and sort of a light bulb went off, and he's like, you know what? That's me. I am that race traitor. That's what he's going to call me. And then I think another light bulb went off and says, hey, that's a pretty badass band name. And we were like 22. It's kind of crazy now being like, I'm 43 and having a name that's pretty provocative and evocative at the same time, and one that confuses a lot of people. You don't really think about like the long-term implications of attaching yourself to something like a band called Race Traitor, but
yeah, I get it, man.
But we're fine with it. It's
talk about that. How has that? Because I know when I talk about New Jersey Revolution Radio and my activism, and I've been an advocate and been blessed to work with some awesome people in advocacy. But all those things do change you personally. They really do, because you can't be a hypocrite, and you're forced to look inwards. If you're really being a good activist, you're looking inwards and you're saying, how do I set an example? How do I, change myself to change the world, as the saying goes. How are you different had you never found this path, or had you gone a different, you'd be a corporate executive. You could be an accountant right now with, the picket fence and all that, and not a struggling, band, right?
Yeah, I mean,
that sounds negative, but there are positives too.
Yeah, I mean, so all of us are in like other professions. Like that's for the most part what we do, except for our drummer Andy, who, like we said, he's in Fall Out Boy, and our guitar player Andrea. She is actually in the music industry. She drives bands on tours and stuff. So cool. The rest of us though are kind of in like the NGO world. So I work for human rights NGOs, and our bass player runs a sort of anti-violence, like public health project.
Cool.
And we will run into things where we'll be at work events and people will say like, what kind of band are you in? And, they'll find out about it. And it's always a point of curiosity. And we're not like in like a normal band. and I'm not even, I mean, first off, the music is crazy. So like when my colleagues Google it, they're just like, that's you, like, screw this is, I guess this is music. But then when they like hear the band name and the politics, it's like really out there. I mean, if you go to our Wikipedia page, which I assume coworkers have Googled before because they'll ask me questions.
Sure,
Where do you have this information, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we're pretty, it's like it says, like, this is a radical politic band, anti-capitalist, anti-white power, and anti-colonial. And so it's not just like we're in a band that's crazy sounding. We're in a band that has this entire package. And I was working for a major human rights NGO. I won't name the NGO. And they were in a scandal at that time because they had put out a bunch of reports criticizing the Israeli government. And it was during one of the Israeli government's incursions into Gaza. And there was reports that were reporting on like the use of white phosphorus and all this stuff.
Yes.
So pro-Israeli organizations basically started attacking them and trying to go after their funding and things like this.
Right.
And I was working in the Middle East division. So everybody in the Middle East, I wasn't working on Israel-Palestine, but everybody in the Middle East division was under scrutiny. And I had been there like 2 weeks at that point, like barely. I walked into this firestorm. It was probably the biggest controversy this organization ever had.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And all of a sudden, my boss, my direct boss, calls me into her office and says, I heard you were in some bands. And I'm like, yes. And she's like, does your band have any lyrics about Israel-Palestine? And we did. I mean, Racetraitor has a song about Israel-Palestine. I was in another punk band that has a song about Israel-Palestine. And I said, yes, we have songs about Palestinian rights. And I had to, and again, I just started. And this was kind of like a dream job. Like, wow, I have this job. It's amazing. And I had to turn over my lyrics to them for them to read them and see if these lyrics were something that could get them into trouble or not.
Wow.
Thankfully, they weren't, or they didn't see them as such. But, you know, that type of stuff, it follows you. So it's not a normal band, and it's a weird band when you're sort of, I guess, more professional settings, even like human rights settings and public health settings.
No,
right?
I get where you come from. I've worked for union labor for a long time, and there are definitely there are straight up political conflicts, but you have to separate yourself, and it's not easy at times. You have to understand that you have a profession, and then you have your activism and your personal opinion, but it's tough for anybody. You know, and with extreme political views, I mean, you want to talk about extreme music, by this country's standards, I have extreme political views. You know, I'm a communist and an open about it. I'm on the red side of the red and black coalition, which I'm trying to be a part of. You know, but it comes into conflict with a lot of things in your life, with family you know, with getting along with certain family members and getting along with coworkers, and, you know, having to go through the work. So that's a sacrifice that activists make, and I know that it's appreciated. The more you're out there, I mean, you're not small, man. You got about 5,000 likes on a Facebook page, so that's pretty good for the left.
But you got to remember, our drummers in Fall Out Boy, who has they have 5 million likes. So we know that we're small, like relative, but we're on the map. We're like not off the map completely. And I think that's, you know, and that's kind of why we do the band. I think that we do the band because we feel like, at least for a certain underground community, we give them something.
Right.
You know, like we like to live holistic lives. So if you have a very value-centric life, so you're a Marxist, you're an anarchist, you're just a progressive, but you believe in social justice, you believe in promoting equality and you know, a truly democratic society, democratic economically, democratic politically, you know, you want your music to reflect that. And so we give a certain niche of people who like this kind of extreme metalcore sound a way to reflect their values also in the music they listen to. And it gives them an emotional attachment to their politics. I mean, music allows you to have an emotional experience with something that otherwise, you know, might be fully cerebral and not kind of like reach the soul as much. And so that's one of the, I guess, things we try to provide. And that's kind of why we sort of keep going as a band. I think we're definitely a cult band. We're definitely a band where there's like 5 kids in each city who like us, and they really, really like us. And then you put all those 5 kids together and you get 5,000 likes on Facebook, and that's
you're being modest here. I think you got a great sound. I think more people like you than what you know.
Thanks.
So the current political scene is something that concerns, I think, just at this point, every American and everybody in the world, because we've got some dangerous things going on that you spoke out about in your show, and why I would encourage people to go and to quote you, to not directly quote you, but to paraphrase you a little bit. You talked about not only your show being something where people could express themselves and come listen to some awesome music and do a little slam dancing, mosh, do a little crowd surfing if you're in the right venue, but also you described it as an organizing space, and you educated in between your songs. You talked about BDS and Palestinian struggles. You talked about the Venezuelan issue. You talked about the fascism rising in Brazil and other areas. What do you, out of those things, we've been following Venezuela over the last couple of weeks here at New Jersey Revolution Radio. Certainly most of the world has at this point. I hope people are starting to pay attention. That situation there is do you do regular talks? Are you speaking out on a particular current issue that you feel is just, this is what I need to be out there yelling about, man, because people got to pay attention? Yeah.
So we have certain things we say almost every show, but it's not like we sit down before the show. We talk about what we're going to talk about. So we look at the audience. How old are they? How political the audience is. We try to gear it towards the audience. Is it all white people? Is it more diverse? Because usually we play like to 90% white people, right?
Yeah.
So, but if it's a more diverse crowd, like if we're playing in like Texas or something, you get a lot of Latinos because a lot of Latinos are into metal and hardcore. So
sure, yeah, man.
You want to be able to speak to your audience. So we look at our audience. We look at the geography. Are we in New York? Are we in the Midwest? And we try to have it all line up. And then also like current affairs. And so we plan broadly what we're going to say, but I don't like write it out. It's mostly off the cuff. So yeah, that night, what we were trying to say when we were talking about Venezuela and particularly Brazil and Israel Palestine, we were trying to talk about how this rise of the far right and fascist right is not something that's isolated to the US, right? It's really a global phenomenon. And these movements are interrelated. You saw Trump's immediate embrace of the new president in Brazil. You see how they're sort of pushing things in Venezuela.
Yeah, very scary.
We really wanted to kind of create a global sort of perspective to our anti-fascist struggle. That was the theme of the fest for people who weren't there. It was a fest focused on anti-fascism and anti-fascist metal. And one thing I think we didn't say this at the show, but you say like, what I've been thinking about today, because you bring up Brazil and Venezuela, and I got into a long discussion with a friend of mine at that fest about this, is Brazil and Venezuela should be warning signs to the left because in both those countries, the left came to power. And in both those countries, the left made mistakes that made them vulnerable, particularly corruption. So, in Venezuela, there's all sorts of factors to the economic meltdown. And some of those factors are externally imposed, like US sanctions. But some of them are based on the government's own mistakes and internal corruption. And in Brazil, they got ousted because Dilma got ousted because of, her and Lula's corruption. Now, the people that ousted him were equally corrupt. It was complete BS. But we got to remember on the left, we're always going to be, especially when we start to form like power, we're always going to be under more scrutiny and than anybody else, and we have to deliver. So we got to think about, as activists, how we're going to deliver effectively as we gain incremental or power, and how we're not going to repeat those mistakes that will make us vulnerable to the reactionary forces and to the ultra right, to say, look at these, these Marxists here are messing up the economy, which is what the narrative is beforehand, or they're really corrupt and they're pocketing money. And that's the exact type of thing we have to think about as we develop movements and as we sort of identify leadership in those movements to avoid. Those should really be wake-up calls, because it's not like the left was out. The left in Venezuela, I guess the left in Venezuela is still there, right? But they're being attacked. They're sort of on life support.
They're still in power, rightfully, as far as I'm concerned.
Oh no, it's totally rightful. They're still in power, but they're going to have to deliver. They can't just survive. If they survive this coup, it's not enough just to survive it. They have to start delivering, and part of that is like they have to really, root out any sort of corruption within their ranks. That is one of, not the only, but one of the many factors that's causing sort of their economy to stagnate.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a lesson.
Now, you bring up these cultural influences and things that we have to watch out for here, and that's the part that really grabbed me, because I think many of us have said, there's Donald Trump, but I think one of the main problems is Donald Trump being identified as the problem, when really it's a cultural and moral problem, I think, as far as we're concerned as a people. Now, that boils down into a microcosm in heavy metal. And I had a chance, because I'm practicing interviewing people in a live scenario, I walked around the crowd a little bit, and I interviewed some of the crowd when I was at the show. And particularly, I found that there were a couple of women that cited being groped at shows, being abused at shows. There were some from the transgender community there talking about how it feels overly masculine in the male, in the male-driven kind of heavy metal community. And I remember that. And I remember when I was, playing drums and I was a little more active, I remember that kind of masculinity, a bit of toxic masculinity that went along with being a heavy metal guy. That was right. That was my image. I'm tough. I got a leather jacket and I play drums in a band and I drive a Trans Am and, I'm cool and I got a quick check and I smoke Marlboro Reds and sometimes I tear the filters off. That's the image to me as a younger man, as that 15, 16-year-old kid that you mentioned briefly, that image. Now, you're fighting that directly. How much acceptance have you gotten with what you would call mainstream? And it's obviously an ongoing battle. Do you see progress being made?
That's a good question. So in our scene, I think the positioning of women is it's better than it was when we started out as a band. The fest was put on by a woman, and if you look at the bands that played, at least I think the majority of band had women in them. Now, the majority of musicians weren't women. It's still kind of this male-driven thing, but it is there has been a shift. And there's also been a shift in queer representation, especially in the metal side of things. In the early 90s, there was kind of a punk, queer punk scene.
And glam metal. Twist,
the
Motley Crue, Poison, Twisted Sister.
The interesting thing is how gender ambiguity used to be this really masculine thing in metal.
Right, yeah.
Right,
those guys were sex symbols. Motley Crue were sex symbols.
Totally.
Yeah.
And then somewhere down the line, I don't know where it was, all of a sudden this very, hyper masculine thing set in. I'm not saying that in a lot of ways, Motley Crue is also hyper masculine, right? But they, at least visually, they got to play with this sort of, gender ambiguity or nonconformity. But that like sort of went out of the window in metal at a certain point.
And that was a great, they were very misogynist in their lyrics, and their portrayals of females, but yet, had this kind of gender bending image that went along with that. And it shows you the levels of gender. I mean, that's kind of like a lesson in gender theory right there, right? That you can have these different levels of presentation of gender.
Well, it also shows how like arbitrary our presentation of gender is too, because this very feminine, like as defined as feminine presentation can be turned into a very masculine thing in a certain context, like a glam metal band. So it's in some ways it's totally arbitrary, and but I don't think people internalize that arbitrariness. But I think now there's like a discussion about it. And I think that it's weird because I think sometimes when we play our music, I feel like it's really testosterone music.
Yeah.
I really feel that. And sometimes, it's in like a space like that, and there's people like moshing to us. And then we played this show in Brooklyn about a year ago, and there was this woman up front, and this kid starts moshing to one of our songs and kicks her in the breast.
Oh.
And I see the whole thing happen. And it's just like one of those moments when you're so uncomfortable because you feel in a way like you contributed to that.
Right.
It just, and I walk her, she's all disoriented, and I see her walk out of the room. And it was our very last song. It was the last song of our set. And I immediately sort of went out and checked in on her, and she was okay, and she was appreciative, and we had a long conversation, and we sort of laughed about it, and everything was cool. But you think about it as this space inviting, and in the early 90s in the punk scene, kind of led by bands like Fugazi. I think people probably remember Fugazi, and they're legendary, but they kind of asked people to stop moshing at their shows. And part of it was that they saw it as like a very gendered thing that was exclusionary of women, exclusionary of people who are physically smaller, or people who just didn't want to get kicked in the head. People talk about it as classes too. Like if you don't have health insurance, how are you going to get your teeth knocked out at a metal show or a hardcore show?
Yeah.
So, I mean, at the same time, we realize that that's how people express themselves sometimes when they're in solidarity with the music, and so it's a balancing act for us as a band. We don't police the audience too much. What we try to do is instill the audience. We try to promote the audience as better angels, I guess, as they say, and get people to think about how they interact, and also about what they do outside of the room. So a lot of punk and hardcore metal are really, the scene is like so important to them. And to us, it's important because it gave us a lot as individuals. So we never discredit it. But what we always want to say is that there's a bigger struggle out there. So a lot of us, and that's true for everybody in your own community, it's really easy to get caught in the infighting in your own community and policing each other within your own community over things that maybe have value, but aren't ultimately determinative of where we're going as a society.
I will stick up for mosh pits and say that mosh pits have tremendous social value if you jump in one or you observe one, and all should be welcome into a mosh pit. And I'm about your age. I'm a year younger than you. I'm 42, and I had the great privilege of taking my son and throwing him into his first mosh pit. I grabbed his glasses and I made sure he was safe. It was at Dragon Force show. So it was a very nice, friendly mosh pit, and he was having fun bobbing his head to the music, but that wasn't good enough. I took his glasses off and I threw him in, and we had a blast. And
I go on mosh pits still sometimes.
Yeah, I'll jump in if it's Tim. I've got a bad back, man. It's not,
Yeah, I mean, I definitely found myself aged out of certain mosh pits, and
yes,
but look, what attracts me to this type of music is the concept of that there's this element of chaos to it.
Yes.
And unpredictability. And we talk about, a lot of people talk about wanting their scenes, like in the underground music scene, there's a lot of discourse about scenes being a safe space for women, a space for queer people, people of color. And I get it in terms of, not wanting fascists there and all of that stuff.
Right. Oh, no.
And I get the questions. I don't want to say that there's not legitimate critiques of the mosh pit and those sorts of things. But to me, what's nice about the underground music scene is that there is some level of chaos and experimentation in that chaos. I don't think a band like Racetraitor could come out of a more regulated sort of artistic environment. So there's a line. So where you draw the line, people are going to draw it in different places. I think there's a consensus in terms of like overt racism, even sort of subtle racism, sexism,
right.
Homophobia. That's not cool. But in terms of, how much violence comes into the art, like
I think if we're going to open up our scene, and we're opening up this show and we're opening up our hearts, we need to open up our mosh pit. And I think that everybody needs to look out for each other, right? I mean, you've heard all the bands, listen, look out for each other. Somebody goes down, don't step on, pick them up, make sure people are safe and having a good time. But a mosh pit is a mosh pit. And I've looked at it from the outside. And there's many occasions where I've been up on the balcony or been in the seats or just on the outskirts, kind of just making sure that, nobody gets hurt behind me, where I just look at it as this really primal thing. And it seems to me, and maybe this is just me justifying, what's going on because I enjoy it so much, but it just seems to me a healthy way of getting out aggression in the right atmosphere when people are having a good time doing it, man. And I've been in a lot of mosh pits where people are just having a good time doing it. And I don't think that's seen from the outside in all the time because it looks violent, pretty much on its surface.
I mean, that's kind of how I think about this music. I mean, you use the phrase toxic masculinity, and yeah. I mean, there's this level of, it's hard to discern the difference between what is nature and nurture in terms of masculine behavior, because on one hand, like testosterone is a real chemical, and it impacts behavior in terms of its promotion of sort of, I guess, what we label as more aggressive behaviors. What's toxic about that is not that it exists and it's part of your biology, it's where it gets directed. So when it gets directed at women in terms of violence, when it gets directed in terms of political violence, domestic violence, child abuse, I mean, that's horrible.
Right. Well, absolutely. I mean,
but if you can channel it into art and channel it into sort of positive, constructive communal experiences, like arts or some sports or whatever, I'm not a big sports guy, but certainly that is a good channeling of it, then that aggression becomes something positive. It's no longer toxic. Yeah. So for me, part of it, this type of music is like a way to channel that part of my being. I have this energy. It's wrapped up in emotions and anger and some intellectual ideas, and I channel it into this kind of primal, aggressive, bass sort of music.
Wow, man!
And I don't know what I would do without it.
Wow, I'd probably, man, if we were having a beer or coffee or something, I'm telling you, this conversation could probably go on for hours. I'm having a blast talking to you. I want to hear more. I'm going to be listening to you more and following you more personally, and I hope my audience will be as well. But before we wrap this up, unfortunately, we're running out of time. But before we wrap this up, I want to make sure you can plug whatever you want to plug, man. You got events, websites, Facebook pages. You let us know. And for all those out there listening, please come to www.njrevolutionradio.com, and all these links will be listed. Where can we find you in the near future, man?
Yeah, we're going to be playing shows in Tulsa, Oklahoma on May 17th. And then we're going to be playing in San Antonio, Texas on May 18th. And then later in May, we're going to be doing a run of dates, maybe. And we'll announce those all on our Facebook page. We just put out a new record. It's called 2042. And for people who don't know, 2042 is the year that the census predicts the U.S. will be a majority minority country, which means white people will be 49% of the population. They'll still be the biggest group, but that seems to freak a lot of people out. If you listen to, I guess, the opposite of this podcast and you listen to Rush Limbaugh or something like that, they freak out about that majority minority status too. They see it as a form of disenfranchisement. And for us, Trumpism was kind of about feeding into that. You know, he sensed that fear and he politicized that fear for his own gain. And so we put out a record called 2042, which you could check out on, I guess, everything, you know, every streaming platform or whatever. It's pretty widely available, I think. But
great.
Apparently Amazon is blocking it.
Oh yeah, apparently. Alexa, play Race Traitor.
I can't find songs by Race Traitor.
We will certainly. I tell you what I did was I looked at Spotify. Your first song that comes up on Spotify is called 3 Minutes of Hate.
Yeah.
And just for those of you on the live stream. I mean, this is just fun, man.
Yeah.
I really, for the life of me, man, I don't understand why this music is not more popular. Because if you ain't into that, you ain't living life right. That's the way I look at it.
We enjoy it.
Great, man. You've been great.
Thank you so much.
Out there listening, and you stuck around for the whole show. Thank you very much. The New Jersey Revolution Radio is co-sponsoring an upcoming event that you can get to in the New Jersey area. For those of you that are supporters of BDS legislation, we know that there is anti-BDS legislation on the move in the states and recently in our federal government. We need our right to boycott. So we are co-hosting with SOMA and a number of other civil rights organizations, Jews for Palestine Right of Return, and the Palestine Right of Return, as well as the BDS movement itself, is putting on a right to boycott event at the Maplewood Memorial Library. This is going to happen on February 27th. So we've got 3 weeks. Mark your calendars for that day, February 27th, from 7 to 8:30 p.m. That's at the Maplewood Memorial Library, 51 Baker Street, Maplewood, New Jersey. We really appreciate it if you can make it out to that, or at least, you know, visit the Facebook page and give us a share, give us some keyboard activism. We appreciate that just as much as we appreciate your donations, your support, your camaraderie, and your work and your music, Bunny. Thanks for joining us tonight, man. Have a good night, all right?
Thank you. It was awesome being here, and that event sounds really awesome. We almost got the cops called on us in New Jersey once for talking about Palestinian rights at a show in New Brunswick. So,
I'll tell you the story next time about how I paid them off with donuts one time. All right. Good night, everybody.